If you're already tucked in, let your shoulders drop a little. Imagine a faint, warm glow, something like the timid nightlight you leave on in the hallway, only softer, flickering as though unsure of itself. Now, imagine it hanging from a hook in a one-room medieval home. That's where we begin, not in a castle dripping with velvet, but in a tiny timber house that smelled faintly of smoke, straw, and the last stew that never quite left the air. Most evenings, the entire family shared that single room. Parents, children, a grandfather who snored like a blacksmith's bellows, and at least one chicken who honestly believed it owned the place. Privacy, as we understand it today, doors that close, curtains that stay shut, do not disturb signs, simply didn't exist. Everything was shared: sound, space, warmth, secrets. Even the bedtime shuffle had its own choreography: shifting straw, sighs of exhaustion, the low creak of a wooden frame settling for the night. And so, intimacy, quiet, hopeful intimacy, had to negotiate its timing. Couples learned to wait for moments when everyone else had drifted into the deep, dreamless agricultural sleep earned by long labor. They also learned the value of stillness. A soft cough might have been enough to summon curious eyes. A misplaced laugh could start rumors that lasted generations. For wealthier folks, the mattresses were thicker, the quilts less scratchy, but the privacy issue persisted. Servants sometimes slept at the foot of the bed, pretending with admirable determination that they noticed absolutely nothing. A noble couple might whisper behind draped fabric, but those drapes were thinner than the gossip that seeped through the walls of their manor. Travel didn't help. On the road, inns often rented beds, not rooms. You could lie down beside a stranger who smelled of horses and barley, separated only by a prayer that he didn't talk in his sleep. Romance required both courage and strategy. First find an empty bed, then convince yourself that the boots lying beside it weren't a warning sign. And yet, people made do. They always do. Human closeness has a funny way of pushing through the cracks. But there was something else shaping these nights, something larger than walls or straw or shyness: the church. Not as an intruder, but as a constant presence, a voice in the background, reminding couples that intimacy was meant for one purpose: creating children. Anything beyond that was excessive, distracting, risky for the soul. Pleasure was tolerated the way thunderstorms were tolerated, sometimes necessary, sometimes frightening, best kept brief. Certain days of the week were off limits. Entire seasons, too. Festivals, fasting periods, holy nights, all marked with invisible barriers. Imagine a modern couple trying to schedule affection around tax season, federal holidays, and the NCAA tournament, and you still wouldn't come close to the medieval calendar of restrictions. A Tuesday in late spring might have been the safest bet. Confession added another layer. Priests, often with the earnestness of a man trying to keep cattle from wandering, asked couples surprisingly direct questions, not out of nosiness, but out of duty. Whether penitent spouses answered honestly is another question. A medieval priest might know more about a household's sleeping habits than he knew about their birthdays. Still, people found room, small moments, quiet moments, to be near each other. Even within rules, the human heart bends, reaches, and persists. And very slowly, as the flickering lantern dims in that single-room house, you can almost hear the straw settling, the breath of tired families falling into rhythm, the whole village drifting toward sleep under a sky that never judged, even if their neighbors did. Close your eyes a little more. We're just beginning. Settle a little deeper into whatever you're lying on. Imagine the air cooling just enough to make you pull the blanket closer. That's how medieval nights often felt. Cool, a bit damp, but steady, like the world itself had exhaled and finally gone quiet. Except the world didn't really go quiet. Medieval houses, even the nicer ones, were never soundproof. Thin wooden walls, loose shutters, and roof beams that behaved like musical instruments during storms meant that everyone heard a little of everyone else. A whispered conversation could drift through the boards like smoke. A sigh, a laugh, a complaint about sore feet. Nothing stayed private for long. That's partly why couples moved slowly, carefully. A glance held half a second too long. A hand brushing against another. A shared smile while hanging laundry. It took so little to say everything without speaking. Some couples became fluent in this quiet language, especially in homes where a single sneeze could start a scandal. In cities, things grew even more complicated. Picture tall, narrow houses leaning inward as if conspiring over the street. Neighbors above you, neighbors below you, neighbors across from you, everyone going about their intimate lives within arm's reach. The smell of dinner or the clatter of a chamber pot hitting stone might echo through the alley long before the sun came up. A tender moment could be interrupted by a donkey kicking a door or a merchant yelling about cabbages, and yet, despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, people learned to carve little sanctuaries wherever they could. A quiet corner behind a curtain, a visit to the barn under the excuse of checking on the animals, a nighttime walk to the well. Even a stolen moment beside a hearth could feel private if the fire was the only witness. But intimacy wasn't always gentle in those times. Life was heavy, uncertain, and often short. Many people married because they had to. Alliances, land, survival. Some discovered affection only after years of shared labor. Others never found it at all. Still, most kept trying, building something warm out of whatever pieces life handed them. The wealthy had their own version of this puzzle. Their bedrooms were larger, but never truly empty. Servants stoked the fire, fetched water, and sometimes slept on stools nearby. A noble couple whispering in bed might suddenly hear the soft patter of feet as someone entered to adjust the candles. Privacy was a luxury so rare that even kings complained about lacking it. Courtiers were everywhere, listening, watching, ready to report a rumor at the first opportunity. Imagine trying to hold someone's hand tenderly while a guard stood 5 feet away pretending to examine a tapestry. Romantic? Not exactly, but that was the reality. Still, desire found its roots, the stolen look during a feast, the meeting in a gallery lit by torches. Even the simple act of brushing someone's sleeve in a corridor could feel electric when every gesture had to be subtle, almost invisible. And then there were the rules, those endless, tangled rules set by the church. Whole months designated as not appropriate. Days dedicated to saints. Days dedicated to sorrow. Days dedicated to reflection. If you marked all the forbidden days on a calendar, it would look more like a tapestry of warnings than a list of options. Couples navigated this labyrinth with creativity. Some followed the rules with sincere devotion. Others quietly bent them with a wink and a prayer for forgiveness. For many, love itself became an act of negotiating sacred boundaries. Yet somehow, across centuries, humanity persisted in finding closeness. in the creak of a door closing softly, in the hush of a shared breath, in a night so still that even the stars seem to lean in to listen. And as you breathe slowly, letting your thoughts drift like a lantern swinging on a hook, you might feel a small echo of that ancient stillness, the feeling of two people trying to find their own quiet corner in a world that never fully slept. Let your breathing settle for a moment. Imagine the faint smell of wood smoke, clean, earthy, the kind that lingers in clothing no matter how often it's aired out. That scent followed medieval families everywhere. In winter, it clung to blankets. In summer, it drifted on the slightest breeze. Even intimacy carried that smell, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. Before we dip deeper into the nights, we need to look at the days, those long, structured, sun-driven hours when affection wasn't something whispered in darkness, but folded into work, chores, and ordinary gestures. Picture a village morning, chickens arguing, a dog stretching, then deciding it's too early to bother with anything. A woman stepping outside with a bucket, hair tied back, breath making little clouds in the cold dawn. Her husband is already chopping wood, not because he particularly enjoys it, but because warmth doesn't create itself. Their eyes meet for a moment, no grand declaration, just a soft shared understanding. Another day, another list of tasks, another chance to keep the household going. It wasn't glamorous, and yet, in that world, the simplest things became tiny anchors of closeness. Passing each other a loaf of bread, fixing a cloak together, sharing the one stool near the hearth because it was the warmest place in the room. There's something tender about that, even if it feels humble by modern standards. But tenderness needed privacy to grow, and privacy was hard-earned. So couples found it in the spaces between obligations. A walk to tend the sheep, a pause behind the barn, kneeling side by side in church, hands almost touching, but not quite. Medieval love was made out of silence as much as sound, and it had to be careful, not only because the walls had ears, but because gossip traveled faster than carts on dry roads. A flirtatious glance, seen by the wrong person, might become a tale that stretched across 3 villages by the next market day. Reputation mattered, even for the very poor. A family's social survival could depend on whispers. Still, affection didn't disappear in this careful world. It adapted. In towns and cities, people navigated narrow alleys with baskets, bumped elbows in marketplaces, brushed hands at water pumps. These tiny encounters built a slow, steady familiarity. A baker's daughter might exchange jokes with the apprentice who swept the street. A merchant's wife might trade smiles with the scholar who lived across the alley. Romance didn't have a stage. It had windowsills and door frames and the soft knowledge of someone walking by at the same hour every morning. But what about arranged marriages? They weren't always cold. Loveless contracts. Some became partnerships stronger than any love match. Others required patience before affection found its footing. Many couples learned to care for each other not through grand gestures, but through everyday effort. The way one might warm the other's boots by the fire before dawn, or mend a sleeve that had torn on a wagon hook. Even in noble households where strategy often replaced emotion, small human moments slipped through the cracks. A shared laugh in a corridor, a whispered conversation behind a tapestry, a moment of unexpected honesty during a feast crowded with watchers, and then, of course, there were the seasons, those quiet sculptors of intimacy. Winter pushed families closer together, literally, because warmth radiated from bodies more reliably than from dying hearths. Spring brought cautious renewal, a long, muddy season when people worked harder, smiled more, and rediscovered sunlight. Summer was fast, noisy, and full of obligations. And autumn was the season of reflection, where long evenings returned and careful touch felt more welcome. These rhythms shaped everything, even affection. So when night finally came, couples carried all those small gestures with them. The shared chores, the sideways smiles, the routine of living side by side. Intimacy wasn't a moment, it was a continuation. And as the fire in that small medieval home burns low, you can almost feel the shift. The room softens, the air cools, and the world narrows to the quiet companionship of the person beside you. A gentle reminder that even in the hardest centuries, people still reached for each other. Let yourself imagine a darker room now. Not frightening, just dim, safe. The kind of darkness softened by a single ember glowing in the hearth. Medieval nights were like that. They wrapped themselves around everything, the cottages, the barns, the winding streets, the small hopes people whispered before sleep. After a long day, families settled in with a kind of practiced choreography. A child turned over. A dog repositioned itself by the door. Someone adjusted a blanket they shared with two siblings. Every movement made a soft, recognizable sound. The rustle of wool, the sigh of settling straw, the quiet thud of a log shifting in the fire. And in that shared space, couples tried to navigate the most delicate question of all. When is everyone finally asleep? It wasn't easy. Children pretended to sleep long before they actually drifted off. Grandparents woke at odd hours, muttering about the cold. A neighbor's rooster might decide incorrectly that midnight was sunrise. Even the wind outside seemed to conspire against privacy, rattling shutters and stirring the animals. Still, there were moments, tiny windows of time, when the world held its breath. A long, exhausted stillness, a hush that settled over the house like a blanket, a feeling that, just for a moment, no one was listening. Couples learned to read that silence like a map. The faint rhythm of someone snoring, the steady breathing of children, the absence of the squeak in the floorboard near the door. These were signals, a quiet permission to be close, to share warmth, not just for survival, but for the comfort of another body beside you. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And yet, even at night, the church's rules hovered like a second shadow. Entire nights were considered improper. Feast days, fast days, days honoring saints, days honoring sorrow, days when the priest had said something stern in his sermon, and suddenly everyone felt watched, even in the dark. Some couples followed the rules carefully, believing that breaking them might invite misfortune. Others whispered to each other with a small, mischievous smile, hoping their confessor wouldn't ask too many questions the next morning. For nobles, nighttime held its own complications. While peasants struggled for privacy, aristocrats struggled with surveillance. Servants tending fires, moving quietly around the bedchamber, adjusting something, bringing wine, pretending not to notice anything at all. A noble couple might lower their voices, speaking as though the tapestry on the wall were listening, and sometimes it was. Rumors among servants were like sparks, small at first, then growing, then leaping from household to household until they reached the ears of someone who shouldn't have heard them, which meant noble intimacy often required strategy, more akin to planning a diplomatic meeting than sharing a tender moment. But despite all this, people still tried to create softness in their nights. A hand held under the blanket, a whispered reassurance after a long, difficult day, a shared memory spoken so softly it seemed to dissolve into the darkness. And there was something deeply human about those nights, something humble and fragile. Not the dramatic romance of stories, but something simpler. Choosing closeness in a world that didn't offer much comfort. Imagine lying there on a straw-stuffed mattress, hearing the breath of the person beside you, knowing that tomorrow will be another long day of mud, labor, cold, obligations. And yet, in the quiet, you feel a tiny moment of peace. Moments like that were their treasure, and now, as the faint ember in the hearth brightens for a second, then dims again, the whole house sinks deeper into sleep. You can almost hear that medieval night breathing with you, slow, steady, unhurried. We're drifting further. There are still many corners of this world to explore. Let the room around you soften a little more. Imagine the faintest draft slipping under a wooden door, cool enough to notice, but not enough to make you uncomfortable. In the Middle Ages, a draft like that was a nightly companion. Walls weren't sealed the way ours are. Roofs shifted with the seasons. Even the best-built homes sighed when the wind changed direction. So warmth became something you didn't take for granted, and sharing warmth was less a choice and more a necessity. A medieval bed was rarely a bed the way we picture it. For the poor, it was a frame filled with straw, covered with whatever blankets a family could afford. Wool, usually coarse, sometimes patched so many times the original fabric had disappeared entirely. For the wealthy, beds were grand, carved things with curtains meant to keep out cold drafts, but even then the air found its way in. That's why people slept close, truly close. Children pressed against their parents. Brothers and sisters curled up like a litter of kittens. Couples lay shoulder to shoulder, sometimes out of affection, sometimes simply because the frost creeping through the shutters made distance impossible. In those cramped sleeping arrangements, intimacy wasn't hidden. It was woven into survival. The body was the warmest source of heat available. A hand reaching for a partner in the dark might have started as simple instinct, not romance. But over time, even practical closeness became meaningful. A shared breath, the slow synchronization of heartbeats, the knowledge that no matter how harsh the world felt during the day, the night still offered a pocket of softness. Yet it wasn't always serene. Medieval nights had their own soundtrack, the cluck of a restless hen, the sharp, sudden bark of a village dog, the rustle of mice, tiny but fearless, searching for crumbs, the hollow groan of timber beams expanding and contracting with the cold. These sounds were familiar, almost comforting, but they could easily break the fragile moment couples tried to claim for themselves. If a child stirred, everything paused. If a neighbor shouted outside, everything froze. If someone knocked on the door, which could mean anything from a late traveler to a sick relative, closeness dissolved instantly. Moments had to be snatched, treasured, guarded. Every night offered only a handful. And still, people found ways to make them matter. In some homes, husbands worked seasonal jobs far from the village. When they returned, often after months on the road, that first night back was wrapped in a kind of quiet reunion. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just two people reminding themselves how it felt to be near one another. In others, couples built rituals, a whispered story before sleep, a prayer murmured together, a soft kiss hidden beneath the blankets where no wandering eye could see. Even the stern expectations of the church couldn't extinguish that. Human closeness has always operated with a quiet stubbornness. For the wealthy, nights held different challenges. Their beds were enormous, but not always comfortable. Mattresses stuffed with feathers could sag. Curtains trapped not just warmth, but stale air. Servants sometimes slept in the same room, curled on stools or pallets, ready to tend to the fire or fetch water. Imagine trying to share an intimate moment while someone politely pretended to be asleep 10 feet away. Nobles solved this the way nobles solved everything, with ceremony. A nod to dismiss the servants, a slow closing of the heavy door, voices lowered to whispers not out of romance, but vigilance. And yet, once the room was finally empty, nobles were just people again. Tired, flawed, sometimes hopeful, sometimes lonely. The softness they sought at night wasn't so different from the softness sought in a peasant's cottage. The world outside was harsh. Reputation was fragile. Life was uncertain. But in the dark, with only a fading ember for company, two people lying close could create a pocket of calm that felt almost sacred. Even now, if you imagine that faint glow, steady, warm, quietly alive, you can feel the rhythm of those nights. Slow, resting, heavy with the sound of breathing. Let your mind settle into that rhythm. We still have further to wander through these quiet hours of the past. Imagine now that the night has deepened. The ember in the hearth is barely more than a soft pulse of red, like a sleeping heartbeat. The wind outside has calmed, leaving the house in a kind of suspended stillness. It is in moments like this, when darkness feels thick, like velvet, that medieval couples truly learned the art of moving quietly. Desire in the Middle Ages wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself or demand a spotlight. It tiptoed, it whispered, it moved with caution, because too much noise could break the delicate spell that night offered. For many couples, tenderness began with something incredibly small, a finger brushing against a wrist, a shift closer beneath the blankets, a shared warmth under the same coarse wool. And all of this had to be done with awareness, not fear, just awareness, that sleeping children lay only an arm's reach away, that an elderly grandmother might wake and ask a question at precisely the wrong moment, that a rooster could crow at any time for reasons known only to itself. People learned to express affection with minimal movement. Touch became careful, intentional. Breath slowed and softened. Even the rustle of straw became something to manage, a sound that might carry farther than expected in the quiet of a one-room home. And yet, this carefulness created its own kind of intimacy. When you must move quietly, you notice more. The warmth of someone's skin, the steady rhythm of their breathing, the softness of their hair, scented faintly of the day's work, and the smoke from the hearth. There's something deeply human about that, how limits can shape tenderness into something unexpectedly gentle. But life wasn't always kind to such moments. If families were large, and they often were, there might be no chance at all for privacy. Some couples waited until the deepest part of the night, a time ancient people called the second sleep, when the whole house sank into a quiet so profound it felt like the outside world had disappeared. Others found small opportunities during the day. A pause in the barn, a moment behind a shuttered window, the brief privacy of collecting kindling in the woods. Even these moments carried risk. A passing neighbor, a wandering child, the soft crunch of footsteps approaching from behind. Still, desire persisted. The church, with all its rules, all its calendars of forbidden days, could never fully contain human longing. Priests preached restraint, moderation, purpose. But the human heart listened with selective ears, and the body had its own understanding of time. Sometimes couples confessed. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they whispered to each other afterward, promising to be more careful next time, though next time always found its way back. In noble houses, desire had a different obstacle: reputation. A noble's life unfolded in full view of others: advisors, ladies-in-waiting, guards, servants, even political rivals. A rumor could cross a kingdom faster than a horse. A single misinterpreted gesture might be discussed at court feasts for weeks. So noble couples learned to craft closeness as though it were a diplomatic mission. A closed door was a statement. A dismissed servant was an announcement. Even lighting fewer candles could signal that the night was meant to belong to two people alone. But despite the effort, nobles faced loneliness too. Expectations were heavy, marriages were arranged, duty came first. Yet even there, perhaps especially there, moments of genuine affection glowed like hidden embers. Imagine a count and his wife, distant during the day, sitting together at night while the fire crackles softly. Their hands meet almost accidentally at first. They quietly share stories they would never confess openly. Not passion, companionship. Not grand romance, but understanding. Human closeness rarely looked the way legends describe it. It was quieter, slower, more cautious, but perhaps more honest for that very reason. Because in a world where everything was shared, work, beds, meals, chores, intimacy became the one thing people tried to protect. And the protection itself made it meaningful. As the night deepens in that medieval house, imagine two people lying close, their foreheads almost touching, the hush around them like a shelter. The ember in the hearth gives one last pulse of light, then softens into darkness. Nothing dramatic happens, just warmth, quiet closeness. A brief, fragile moment held carefully between sleep and waking. These were the nights that shaped medieval love, unremarkable to the world, unforgettable to those who lived them. Picture the medieval night beginning to thin. The sky outside is still dark, but not the deep ink of midnight, more the faint blue that hints gently that morning is coming. Inside the cottage, nothing moves at first. People don't leap out of bed the moment a rooster makes a single noise. They surface slowly, like swimmers rising from deep water. Before dawn truly arrives, there's a strange, quiet hour where everything feels suspended. Even the cold hesitates, unsure whether to sharpen or retreat. In that hour, couples often found themselves closest, not in passion, not in secrecy, but in the simple act of being near each other before the day's weight settled on their shoulders again. For a few soft minutes, the world asked nothing of them. No chores, no rules, no watching eyes, just warmth. It was then, in that half-light, that partners sometimes whispered things they'd kept to themselves during the noisy day. Small reassurances, private jokes, the kinds of confessions that feel easier when you're still wrapped in blankets and sleep. A man might murmur, The ox threw his shoe again yesterday, in a tone that meant more than the words. A woman might reply, "We'll fix it today," in a tone that meant we, not you. Little threads, weaving a quiet partnership long before breakfast, and then, slowly, reluctantly, the house began to wake. A child kicked off a blanket. Someone coughed. A dog stretched, then shook its fur with a dramatic flourish that sent dust into the air. The fire crackled softly, asking to be fed. The moment of just the two of us dissolved into the shared life of the household, the way a dream dissolves when daylight touches it. Yet the closeness from the night clung to them, subtle but real, like the warmth a hand leaves on another hand long after it pulls away. In noble households, dawn arrived with more ceremony, but less comfort. Servants entered quietly, pretending not to notice if the couple still lay close together. Curtains were drawn back. Water was brought. Fires were tended. Morning routines replaced whatever softness the night allowed. A nobleman might rise with a practiced mask, calm, authoritative, already thinking about politics. His wife might sit at the edge of the bed, hair loose, savoring the final seconds before duty reclaimed her. Their nights were often the only times they were allowed to be simply human. Dawn reminded them of the roles they had to step back into. But no matter the household, humble or aristocratic, mornings carried a kind of unspoken agreement. Whatever intimacy the night offered belonged to the night alone. Daylight was for work, for survival, for expectations, for the endless, dusty path that life in those centuries required everyone to walk. And yet, something of the tenderness remained. You can picture a woman brushing crumbs from her husband's cloak before he heads into the cold, or a man silently filling a bucket so his wife doesn't have to break the morning ice at the well. Tiny gestures, quiet care, shadows of the closeness from the hours before. Even the routines that seem mundane now were rooted in this: fetching water together, tending animals side by side, repairing a broken latch in companionable silence. Work in the Middle Ages was grueling, yes, but it also created opportunities for couples to share time without pretense. Those shared moments were the foundation of medieval intimacy. Nights were too short, days too demanding, privacy too fragile. Most affection flowed in small, steady streams, not grand rivers. And in a world where nothing stood still, where life changed with each season and hardship was constant, those streams mattered more than anything. Imagine now the sky outside turning a little brighter. A faint gold touches the horizon. The straw mattress rustles one more time as someone sits up, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The night has ended. But what it gave, warm hands, soft breath, slivers of tenderness, doesn't vanish. It follows them quietly into the day ahead. As dawn stretches fully across the medieval world, the softness of night fades into the practical noise of morning. But here is something important. Intimacy didn't vanish with the darkness. It simply changed shape. In the daylight, affection lived between tasks in the tiny folds of daily life. Picture a woman kneeling by a basin, scrubbing clothes against a wooden board. Her sleeves are rolled up, the cold water numbing her fingers. Her husband walks by carrying firewood. He pauses, shifts his grip, and gently nudges the basin closer to the sunlight so her hands won't freeze so quickly. It's such a small thing. But in a world where small comforts were rare, it carried the weight of a love letter. Or imagine a man hammering a loose hinge on a barn door. His wife brings him a clay cup of warm ale, not because he asked, not because she must, but because she noticed his breath fogging in the morning chill. Their eyes meet briefly. No grand gesture, just warmth passing between two people who live more in tasks than in words. That was medieval affection, quiet, woven into motion, rarely spoken aloud. Couples in medieval towns had their own version of this. Narrow streets meant everyone lived close, so affection had to be subtle to avoid becoming gossip. A married pair might walk side by side carrying baskets from the market, brushing hands only when no one was watching. A wife might straighten her husband's cloak before he left to bargain for goods. A husband might save the softest piece of bread for her from the morning batch. Little things, but little things add up. And in that era, gestures were more reliable than vows. But not all relationships were equal. Marriage among peasants often grew from shared work, shared burdens, shared weather. Marriage among nobles, that was different. Duty wove itself into every hour of noble life. A countess could love her husband deeply or not at all. And either way, she would still be expected to walk beside him at feasts, sit across from him at councils, and maintain the fragile balance of alliances with a smile she didn't always feel. Yet even in the highest halls, human tenderness found its cracks to bloom through. A nobleman might return from a long journey and place a foreign trinket on his wife's table, a carved comb, a silk ribbon. A noblewoman might gently scold her husband for skipping meals, her voice too sincere to be mere courtesy. Affection among nobles was like candlelight, fragile, often hidden, but unmistakable when it flickered. Even in monasteries and convents, places where intimacy was forbidden, quiet bonds formed. Monks worked side by side in gardens, sisters sewed robes together in silence, and emotional closeness grew in ways that were never meant to be romantic, but were undeniably human. Loneliness is powerful, and companionship is a balm. But for married couples, daylight brought different challenges. Work was heavy, exhaustion constant, illness common, and privacy nearly impossible. So where night offered warmth, day offered connection. Slow, practical, unpolished. A shared loaf, a shared burden, a shared sigh when a tool broke or the fire went out. These weren't romantic scenes, they were the architecture of partnership. If the Middle Ages had a love language, it wasn't poetry or flowers or whispered confessions. It was survival. It was attention. It was the way two people could make a hard life feel just a little softer for one another. And beneath all this was a simple truth. When life is difficult, love doesn't grow loud. It grows steady. The kind of steady that survives winters, wars, debts, bad harvests, and the scrutiny of neighbors. The kind of steady that lingers in the little details. How someone folds your cloak, how they greet you when you return home, how they stand beside you without asking why. We often imagine medieval love as either dramatic or non-existent. But the real story lived in these quiet moments, woven into the rhythm of daily survival. As the midday sun warms the stone of a cottage wall, as carts rattle across village roads, as a wife hangs laundry and a husband mends a net, their connection moves like a soft thread, barely seen, but strong enough to hold a life together. Night may have offered closeness, but day taught people how to stay close, and now, as we prepare to drift toward the evenings again in our journey, take a slow breath. Feel how the medieval day begins to settle, preparing to fold once more into the gentle dark. As the medieval day stretched toward evening, the world began its gentle slow down. The sun slipped lower, casting long, quiet shadows across fields and cobblestones. Fatigue settled into bones without asking permission. But there was something almost comforting about this hour, when the day finally unclenched its fists and allowed people to breathe. In most homes, evening meant the familiar routine of preparing a simple meal, not a feast, just stew thickened with whatever vegetables survived the day, maybe a scrap of meat if fortune had been kind, maybe just broth if it hadn't. Couples worked side by side, one tending the pot, the other breaking stale bread into chunks, each movement part of a practiced dance. That shared labor built a deeper closeness than any whispered confession. Two people leaning over the same wooden table. Two sets of hands knowing exactly how to move without colliding. Two breaths mingling in the steam from the pot. Outside, children played until the light thinned too much to see their own feet. Chickens settled for the night. Dogs circled twice before lying down, noses tucked under their tails. The whole village exhaled in unison, easing into the softer rhythm of dusk. Inside, the hearth took center stage again. It was the heart of the home, not only for warmth and food, but for conversation, the rare kind that wasn't rushed or interrupted by work. Imagine a husband and wife sitting close, sometimes with children asleep nearby, sometimes alone at last. They talked about the harvest, the weather, the idiot neighbor who let his goat wander again, the rumor that someone in the next village had seen a shooting star. Nothing grand. But in those small topics, comfort lived. Some nights were heavier. A bad crop forecast, a sick cow, a tax collector who hinted he might return soon. In such moments, couples often leaned into each other, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the weary honesty of two people who knew life wasn't easy and were grateful they didn't face it alone. And then there were the evenings touched by a softer, unspoken longing, a hand lingering on a shoulder. A shared smile held a heartbeat longer, a brief hush between sentences that felt like an invitation, all subtle, all careful, because even though nighttime offered some privacy, evening still belonged to everyone, the children, the elderly, the neighbors who could hear through walls as easily as through open doors. But as the sky dimmed fully and the village's scattered candle flames appeared one by one, something shifted. The world outside quieted. The noise of carts faded. The smell of smoke thickened. People retreated into their small circles, and the shadows inside the home grew deeper, more intimate. It's here, in this liminal moment between day and night, that medieval couples often exchanged their truest expressions of affection. Not passion, not secrecy, but partnership. A wife might hand her husband a cup of warm ale to ease the ache in his shoulders. He might wrap a cloak around her back when she shivered at the door. They might sit close enough that their knees touched under the table. Nothing dramatic, but real. Even for nobles, evening softened the grand performative roles they had carried all day. A baron might shed his mantle and sit beside his wife while servants dimmed the torches. For a short while, they were not symbols, not alliances, not titles. They were simply two people, tired and human. And then, inevitably, the ritual of preparing the bed began. Straw shaken or replaced, blankets spread, curtains drawn, candles lowered or snuffed. The house entered its nightly cocoon. For couples, this was the moment when the world outside finally loosened its grip. All the duties and rules and prying eyes fell away. The softness they'd been gathering all day, through looks, gestures, shared work, shared silence, finally had space to unfold. The night reclaimed them, and even though the medieval night was rarely peaceful, dogs barking, wind rattling shutters, children rolling over, animals shifting in the loft, the simple act of lying beside someone brought a sense of steadiness that people clung to. Because in a world that could change with a single storm, a single illness, a single decree, closeness was both fragile and precious. Now, imagine the room growing dimmer, the fire dropping to a low glow, the last voices of the village fading into crickets and wind. This is where night begins again, where tenderness, quiet, careful, persistent, waits in the dark, and where once more two people reach for each other in the only privacy the world allows. The last of the daylight has slipped away now. In the medieval world, and perhaps in your imagination at this moment, darkness finally settles not as an intruder, but as a blanket, a quiet, heavy, calming presence that asks nothing except stillness. Inside the cottage, the fire has burned down to a soft orange glow, not bright enough to read by, not bright enough to work by, just bright enough to remind everyone that warmth still lives in the center of the room, holding the house together like a slow beating heart. The day's tools have been put away, the bowls rinsed, the door barred, the animals quieted. Children, curled in their shared bed of straw and wool, drift in and out of dreams. Somewhere in the rafters, a hen murmurs in her sleep. A few pieces of wood crack softly as they settle, and in the hush of this ordinary night, intimacy, the quiet humankind, returns to its rightful place. Not dramatic intimacy, not bold or loud or stolen in secret hallways, just the kind that grows out of a long day lived side by side. A couple lies close on their straw mattress. Their bodies, exhausted but warm, find a familiar shape together. The blankets scratch a little, wool always did, but the warmth underneath is comforting, uncomplicated. Outside, the wind brushes against the shutters in slow waves, like someone breathing on the other side of the wall. The village dogs bark at something unseen, then stop. A distant owl repeats the same low note, steady and calming. Inside, the air thickens with that particular nighttime stillness, the kind only old wooden houses know, the kind that settles not just in the room, but in the bones, and in that stillness, two people whose entire lives are built from chores and routines, seasons and obligations, share something that is theirs alone. Maybe it begins with a hand finding another under the blanket, maybe with a tired smile barely visible in the dying glow of the hearth, maybe with a soft whisper about nothing at all. Or maybe they don't speak. Maybe they just breathe in the same slow rhythm, letting the world outside shrink until it feels very far away. For centuries, historians tried to write about kings and battles, laws and wars, but they rarely stopped to imagine these moments. That's the strange thing. The loudest parts of history survive on paper, but the quietest parts survive in us. Because tenderness, soft, careful, unremarkable tenderness, has always been the true constant. Even in grand castles, where stone walls trapped sound and political eyes watched every gesture, lovers whispered to each other behind heavy curtains. They slipped into warmth despite duty, despite fear, despite the endless machinery of power. Even in monasteries where vows forbade touch, companionship grew in silence, brothers kneeling side by side in cold chapels, sisters sewing in the amber light of small windows, finding comfort in the closeness of shared purpose. Even in cities where noise never slept and alleys crowded with people, couples found moments to lean their heads together as they carried water from the well or walked home beneath torches that flickered like uncertain stars. And even now, hundreds of years later, you can feel a little of that world if you close your eyes. The straw, the wool, the faint smoke, the quiet night, and the gentle, persistent way people reached for each other despite everything. Medieval intimacy wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It wasn't framed in poetry or gilded halls. It lived in touches, in routines, in chance quiet hours that slipped between the demands of life. It lived in knowing someone's footsteps in the dark, in leaning close when winter winds cut through the shutters, in whispering secrets when the whole house finally slept, in breathing warmth into the cold, long nights. And as you picture yourself lying on that straw mattress, feeling the world slow to a near stillness, imagine the softness of that moment spreading through the centuries like ripples in a quiet pond. The fire gives its final sigh. The cottage grows dimmer. The village outside drifts deeper into silence. Two people rest shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth because warmth is a treasure, sharing breath because breath is the calmest language humans know, sharing space because closeness, even in its simplest form, has always been our first shelter. And just like that, the medieval night becomes still, gentle, whole, full of the same quiet tenderness that has carried human hearts from one age to the next. Let the warmth of that image stay with you for a moment. Let it soften your thoughts. Let it wrap around you like a blanket, steady and reassuring. The story, like the night, has come to rest.